Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. You can support my own locals, subscribe star, and buy me a coffee, as well as check out my Substack. So I'm again joined by Keith Preston and Swithin Dobson. Unfortunately, Terminal Philosophy's had some technical difficulties, so as far as I know, he will not be joining us today. We're here to discuss another video by the channel What If Alt Hist, Why Communism is a Failed Religion. So just as a brief introduction, what I really like about the channel What If Alt Hist is, even if I don't agree with everything he says, he's trying to put together a cohesive picture of the world in a way that's not as limited as the older models that we're all familiar with. He's trying to do something new. And I think in the process of doing something new, you're not going to get everything right the first time. But he's putting together different interpretations and models and methods that I think are really helpful and in some sense mirror what I've been doing over the last 15 years. So he's viewing communism as a religion, and he specifically cites Emile Durkheim. I think he mentions that, was it Huxley or Wells had or maybe it was Russell, had a comparison of communism as a kind of degenerated Abrahamic religion. And he had like this graph where he had the comparisons of the different things, like, the fall, which is the rise of capitalism, and then the second coming, which is the revolution, and hell, which is the punishment of the bourgeoisie, and things like that. So that's one claim. And I know, Swithin, you're familiar with Rothbard and the Marxist Satanic Letters. So the idea that Marx was motivated by some sort of intrinsic Satanism or some sort of animus against the Christian religion isn't brought up in this, but I think does feed into the idea of Marxism as a religion. And then also he seems to have as an operating assumption that there's this sort of dog-eat-dog world of Darwinianism applied in human societies. He mentions this book throughout by a Jewish sociologist. So his main argument is that it's a religion that is only left-hand brain, so it's just, models and science, and you can't really think about more, poetry or more nuanced ways of looking at things. That would be the right-hand side of the brain. And as the left-hand side of the brain, it's a religion that is based on this sort of utopian optimism as a decayed form of Christianity, and just refuses to engage with the real world or opposition. He says a lot that, well, the communists he's argued with don't act in good faith. They always shift the goalposts. I can say from experience that's largely been true for me as well. I think there are some exceptions. I don't think Caleb would necessarily do that, or Hawes, but they're relatively new. And I don't even know if What If Alt Hist is familiar with these guys' work. But I will say this, looking at the work of actual communists and then looking at Hawes and others like him, the kind of like 90s aughts and early 2010s Western Marxism is a completely ersatz mismatch. It has nothing to do with actual Marxism, and that's been one of the strengths of these new tankies online. So I think one claim could be made that What If Alt Hist is arguing not against real Marxism, but Marxism as he's had it presented to him by the Western Marxist left, which is completely ersatz. Keith.
Yeah, I think we really have to make a sharp distinction between the so-called Western left and actual Marxism. Early on in my amateur career as a critic of political correctness, or what is today called wokeness, I tended to be more heavily influenced by the cultural Marxism thesis than I would be today, in part because back then the only scholars that were really critiquing political correctness in any serious way were paleoconservatives, and the cultural Marxism thesis is common in those circles. The idea, of course, behind cultural Marxism is that it's derived from the Frankfurt School or from Antonio Gramsci, who was an Italian communist during roughly the same period. And the idea is that, well, you have classical Marxism, which is Marx and Engels themselves, and then you've got Leninism, which is the idea of the vanguard party and all that kind of stuff, and imperialism, and then you've got social democracy, Bernsteinism, and then you've got Maoism, which shifts the focus to rural peasants rather than industrial proletarians. And then you have the Frankfurt School, which is all about culture. But a problem with the cultural Marxism thesis is that once you remove economic determinism from Marxism, you no longer have Marxism, you have something else. And, you know, the cultural Marxism is based on this, well, the Frankfurt School in critical theory is based on a number of ideas, which a serious communist would have to reject. One of them is the idea that culture precedes economics. Marx's a core idea of Marxism is that the dominant ideas in a society are going to be those of the materialist base, that is, whoever controls the means of production and whatever dominant mode of production that you have. Marxism is a radical rejection of the idealist view of how societies evolve and unfold. Once you take that aspect of Marxism out of it, you don't have Marxism because it's such a critical component of Marxist theory, historical materialism, and the rejection of idealism. But Marxism, I agree, does function as a religion. As for Marx himself, Marx was of Jewish heritage. His family had converted to Lutheranism in Germany, in Prussia, as a matter of political convenience. His father was the equivalent of what in America would be called a district attorney, a state solicitor. And I suspect that a great deal of Marx's antipathy for society was rooted in the fact that he himself came from an outgroup, a marginalized outgroup in society. I do think the similarities between Marxism and Christianity are interesting, and in many ways, as many other commentators have pointed out, you can draw parallels between Marxism and Christianity, and say that Marxism is a kind of secularized, heretical Christianity, in the sense that it empties Christianity of the metaphysical and theological ideas, and it adopts a purely materialistic framework. But as Todd said, it has some similar ideas, like you have, instead of original sin, you have alienation. Instead of the second coming or eschatology, you have the proletarian revolution. Instead of the kingdom of heaven, you've got the dictatorship of the proletariat. So it is similar in that way. And I think that for many people in the 19th and 20th century, Marxism was a substitute religion. As the traditional religions started to decline in influence after the Enlightenment, people started to develop new philosophies and new ideas that were essentially substitute religions or surrogate religions. And of course, Nietzsche was one of the ones that famously pointed this out, that socialism is just Christianity without a Christ, basically. Although you have Christian socialists as well. It's very interesting how you have a lot of people that seem to be very interested in both Christianity and socialism. Like I used to come across a lot of these kinds of people in the U.S. left when the liberation theology and the Catholic left was influential. But I think, though, that classical Marxism and Marxism-Leninism, communism, did function psychologically as a religion for many people, whether it's a religion or not, in a way that this modern Western Marxism doesn't. We were talking before the beginning of the program. I think that the Western left in its present form, rather than being a revolt against oppressive material conditions like the historic labor movement, is the product of non-oppressive, of economic prosperity. Because if you look at when the modern Western left really started to become influential, it was in the post-war period after World War II, when for the first time in history in Western society, specifically the United States, you had societies where people really weren't that worried about their material interests anymore. I mean, some people were, but most people, the majority of the working class, say in post-war America, Western Europe, some other developed countries, people didn't have to worry as much about food, shelter, that kind of stuff. So material interests tended to take a back seat to cultural interest and things like that. In fact, the radicals of the 60s, including Herbert Marcuse, who was one of the founders of Western Marxism, they had this idea, well, the working class has now been bought off by the material abundance that we see in this post-war culture. Now that the average working person can work 40 hours a week and own a house and a car and a washing machine and go on vacation for 2 weeks and that kind of stuff, workers aren't really interested in revolution anymore. So we've got to look for other groups that are going to be the foundation of the revolution. Right? But all of this is a departure from communism. One guy who has written about this in a way that I think is really interesting is the late Gary North, who was a far right-wing Calvinist conservative and also something of a free market libertarian. But he has an essay from about 10 years ago called Cultural Marxism is an Oxymoron. And also Paul Gottfried. Paul Gottfried has written about this in ways that are interesting. But the thing is, if you look at Marx's actual writings during his career and those of his immediate associates like Engels, they were constantly lambasting the kinds of people that today would be called Marxists or communists or socialists or progressives. They absolutely hated these, progressives, socialist, Fabian types that were obsessed with, piecemeal economic reforms, environmentalism, nudism, animal rights, sexual experimentation, all of the stuff, eugenics, all of the stuff associated with the progressive left of the late 19th and early 20th century, precisely the kinds of people who were the definitive element of the left today. And that's why in more recent times, we've started to see people who take Marxism seriously, like Caleb Maupin or like Paz Infrared, like maybe some others in that vein. I only have a surface level knowledge of that scene, but you started to see this massive split now between actual Marxists and these cultural Marxists or woke leftists or whatever you want to call them, and that's why they're not compatible with each other. Like I said, Marx absolutely hated these kinds of people.
Right, Swithin.
Well, firstly, whether communism is a failed religion, the question is whether it's a religion, and that, of course, depends on what you mean by it. I think, for all practical purposes, I think Emile Durkheim's 19th century French sociologist's definition of religion is probably reasonable, which is, quote, a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, i.e. things that are set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite in one single moral community called the church, all those who adhere to them, end quote. Now, under such definition, basically anything can count as a religion. Not anything, but I mean, things like organized sports, for instance. I mean, the NFL in America could easily be shown as a religion. Going to the games, going to the temple, various rites, initiations that you might do to be joined, like the ultras, or whatever the equivalent are in America of those. Those are the terms used for the European fans in like continental Europe. You've got your team, you've got the other teams, and you're one body, and the other teams are the enemy. And which I think it does function that way, and based on that, I mean, Marxism clearly is a religion of sorts. It has, the in-group and the out-group, the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy, and the working class. So it's clearly got things that are profane, things that are sacred, but also additionally, though, Marxism, rather than say, oh well, I suppose American football and soccer in Europe has a calendar of sorts, but I mean, Marxism has a meta-narrative in a way that Christianity has a meta-narrative. Christianity, creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Marxism, you have this oppression by the aristocracy, and then you got this determination with the bourgeois revolutions, and then the final proletarian revolution. I can't remember if Marx, I'm not sure if he probably did, or some later Marxists basically posit a fawn type situation from sort of like primitive hunter-gatherer types associated, probably, I think, from some at least, with private property, and that's really the and also conquest, and it's sort of downhill from there. But ultimately, there's going to be this glorified state of the proletarian revolution. So, I mean, it's not merely a religion solely on functional basis. I mean, it really does have those meta-narratival trappings that more mundane things, which do function as a religion, as organized sports, and also politics as well, just as party politics, is like, oh yeah, we're going to own the Dems or own the Libs because they're the opposition, and we've got all these rights and rituals associated with the presidency and all those other things. Yeah, I think whilst it doesn't posit the supernatural as such, it has a lot of trappings of some of things that everyone would really recognize as religion. Then the question is whether Marxism has failed, to which the answer is, well, yeah. I mean, I remember Wolf. Oh, what the heck's that guy called? Richard Wolff. Is that his name? I can't remember.
Yeah, Richard Wolff goes around a lot and has debates.
Yeah. So he debated David Friedman. He tried to make the claim that things like, East Germany was always backwards relative to West Germany, so the comparisons between East and West failed, and various things like that. Although I did think that David Friedman's response to that was interesting. He made the argument that how you can tell whether a country is relatively better than another is whether people want to emigrate there or whether they want to leave. And it seemed pretty darn clear that people wanted to leave East Germany and go into West Germany. And the same is the case of North and South Korea to a large extent. I mean, maybe some people voluntarily emigrate to North Korea from the South. I don't think there'd be too many of them. And that at least shows relative superiority. Now, again, though, of course, you could say that, well, everyone would have left East Germany anyway, even if they had a unified German state. It would have been internal migration, because these Germans were backward. But I mean, from any sort of natural experience we have, North and South Korea and East and West Germany, it seems pretty clear that Marxism has failed. Then again, of course, you can always claim real Marxism never was tried. So I'm saying Marxism and communism is a synonym. I'm aware there's different forms of communism, so I'm using synonymously here. You can always make that claim, but it's never fared too well.
A couple other points that he makes are that Marxism assumes the fungibility of humans, the blank slate, and that's one of the things that Richard Pipes points out in his writings against the communist revolution in Russia. This blank slateism that you can just mold people into whatever shape you want, whereas, what evolved his appeals to certain genetic findings, certain psychological findings that men and women are different, the ethnicities are different. You can't treat them as all the same. And then this is what he considers one of the fundamental errors of Marxism. Though I would also argue by that logic, that's also a fundamental error of modern liberalism, since it really assumes the same thing. And then also the fact that he believes in this sort of social Darwinian view of human life, that Marxism has this more utopian position that, we're not stuck in this struggle for survival forever. I mean, the one thing is, it would have been nice to see him engage with Kropotkin, because basically you got Herbert Spencer versus Kropotkin. Herbert Spencer says that, that if we interpret Darwin correctly, we're going to have this dog-eat-dog world. And then Kropotkin's like, well, no, we have mutual aid. I think the German National Socialists, when they view it as competition between nations, that's a little more credible. But the problem is, we don't fund this level of conflict but within a species. So humans are always seem to be at war with each other. But it would be incorrect to say that lions are always at war with each other. They might be competing for resources, they might be competing for territory, but different lion clans don't go to war with each other on, a basis like that. And the competition that is occurring is between species, not necessarily intra-species. And I think that's where this whole thing actually breaks down. because if we would not expect to see this level of intrahuman species conflict, if you were using Darwinian modeling as an example. Keith.
Yeah, it's clear that Marxism, in many ways, is an outgrowth of liberalism in the sense that it does have some of the same basic presumptions as liberalism. And I think the tabula rasa idea, the blank slate, is one of the main ones. There is, I mean, Marxism was influenced by classical political economy, like the Ricardian economic models and those kinds of things. And it was also influenced by Enlightenment philosophy by Locke and Rousseau in particular. So there's definitely that dimension of Marxism. But I also think it can be argued, as Murray Rothbard argued and as George Watson argued, that socialism broadly had a quasi-conservative dimension in the sense that it was something of a reaction against the radicalism of the Enlightenment, of liberalization, of industrialization, of capitalism, obviously, and Marxism is partially influenced by the Enlightenment, but it's also influenced by the counter-Enlightenment, by the Romantics, by German idealism, and some of those schools of thought as well. And if you actually read the fine print of the Communist Manifesto, there's actually a section where they talk about the breaking down of feudal bonds and that kind of thing in a way that's almost lamenting this, kind of like a European-style conservative. And I do think that there is this kind of quasi-conservative dimension to Marxism that I think fits with the theory that, or the thesis that Marxism is a kind of quasi-religion. It's a modern, secular religion that's a reaction to the impact of secularization and liberalization and industrialization and scientism and things of that nature. But as to whether Marxism is a failure, a big part of that, I think, or whether communism is a failure, a big part of that would be, how do you even define these things? But first of all, how do you define failure? Whenever I've discussed this with communists, and I've had these discussions going back for about 35 years now, the counter argument they use to the standard narrative that, well, communism is a failure, is they'll say, wait a minute, communism is not a failure. Look at the industrialization of the Soviet Union and look at the growth of China in the last 4 decades, and look at how the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany and all these kinds of things. Now, and then another argument is that you shouldn't compare them to the West, like we shouldn't compare communist systems to England and America and Northern Europe. We should compare them to whatever came before in those particular systems. Was communism an improvement over Tsarism? Was it an improvement over what existed prior to the 1949 revolution in China and so forth? And of course, the counter argument is, well, what about all the people killed in those revolutions and purges and state repression? And then the counter argument to that is, well, they always had violence in those political cultures, and they always had starvations and famines, and they always had repression. And besides that, it didn't happen, and it was justified. So that's a common narrative you get there. Now, I think that some of the economic and technological arguments that are used to defend communism were refuted by Anthony Sutton, who said that the economic development, technological development you found in those countries largely was due to the influx of Western capital and technology, not something that was an indigenous creation. So that, I think that's a major flaw in their theory. But ultimately, my view of Marxism itself is the same as Bakunin's. Bakunin was an anarchist in the 19th century, a personal enemy of Marx. And he used to say that if you listen to this guy, you're going to get a state that's as despotic as anything today, as despotic as the Tsar, as despotic as Bismarck or whatever. And that's what happened. And also, if you go and you read the early criticisms of Bolshevism by anarchists like Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, they basically said this guy, talking about Lenin, they said this guy's the Tsar all over again. It needs even worse. I think that Murray Bookchin also had it right. Murray Bookchin was an anarchist who was around he was active from the 60s through the 90s, maybe. Murray Bookchin said that he thought that the despotic states that we've seen in the Soviet Union and Maoist China were a natural outgrowth of Marxist theory, that it wasn't just an aberration, that if communism is really what you're seeking, then you have to have this kind of despotic state. Because everybody's got to be on the same page as far as a centrally planned economy, and all wealth and property's got to be centralized into the hands of the planners and these kinds of things. So something like Stalinism or Maoism is a logical outgrowth of Marxism. And now I suppose to people who think tyranny is okay or whatever, that's not an issue. You could argue, well, no, the communist regimes of the 20th century were great, like the ancient Egyptian pharaohs and Roman Caesars were great. So, which that in turn, puts you on an arch reactionary camp. But yeah, so that is what I see communism as being. I see the 20th century totalitarian regimes, certainly the Third Reich, which wasn't communist, and obviously, but the Third Reich. The despotic Marxist-Leninist regimes, the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, all of these places. I see these places as having been resurrections of the ancient God Emperor tyrannies from antiquity. The idea that you basically deify the leader as a quasi-divine figure. You've got statues of this guy everywhere, and personality cult built up around this guy. And when Lenin died, they stuffed him and put him in a mausoleum, to everybody to come and essentially worship. So, that's ultimately the religious aspect of communism. I mean, it's like the God Emperor worship of the Caesars or of the ancient pharaohs. It's just a modern secular version of that.
Just real quick to your point about the logical extension of Marx, especially when you read his commentary on the Paris Commune. He literally said their mistake was they didn't go far enough and just kill everybody. And then Lenin quotes that in his own writings decades later to justify what he's doing in Russia.
Yeah, and there's another quote from Friedrich Engels where he's responding to the anarchist critics of Marxism, like the followers of Proudhon and Bakunin. And he says, have these guys ever seen a revolution? A revolution is the most authoritarian thing there is. It involves one population segment arming itself and forcing its will on the other segment of the population. And they specifically, Marx and Engels specifically cited the reign of terror as a model for how to conduct a revolution. You seize power and you kill your enemies. That's how it's done.
Okay, Swithin.
Well, that's certainly a way of doing a revolution, and it kind of works. What I was going to go back to, which I think is an interesting, it's more Marx than communism. Marx very much goes into sort of social determinism and sort of economic determinism. But this is interesting to contrast with his view of the blacks, who he is not hugely complimentary of, and basically treats them as lazy and stupid, but in a sense, but in a way, sort of like genetically so, or they're just predisposed to be so, even though he is supposed to, in theory, have this blank slate, this kind of blank slatism, and I think that's an interesting tension within his thought. That you don't actually have the socially determined. There's this group of people who are a bit stupid, really. And this actually jives with something. I remember Jared Taylor saying he had a talk with some sort of liberal of some description, who said, what was it? Something like, if what you say, that is Jared Taylor says, true about the blacks is true, then we'd basically have no option but to kill them. It was like this leftist position that unless they could be brought up to a white liberal leftist level, then they would have to be killed, or at least I think it was something like that. I may be misremembering it.
Real quick, just to interject, Swithin, there was a writing from 1848, 1849, where Marx said that there were many retrograde ethnicities in Europe that would have to be exterminated before a revolution could take place.
Well, that proves my point. Good quote. Yeah, so I just think it's I suppose I'm just saying that in sort of modern leftist thought, the idea that there are sort of these undesirable groups, and that if we kind of get rid of the veil of tabula rasa and sort of social determinism, we can't really do anything about it. We just have to get rid of them somehow. So yeah, and also with Marxism, which is works with tabula rasa thing to some extent. Well, no, not well. This is no. Well, anyway, you have the view that the working class in every country has more in common with each other than they do of, say, the bourgeoisie. So the English bourgeoisie would have more in common with the French bourgeoisie, and the English working class have more in common with the French working class, and somehow they could get this international revolution, which just clearly seems to be utterly false empirically, that this sort of economic class solidarity exists, which is why sort of communism in one country of the Stalinist variety seemed to make significantly more sense. And so, as an aside, is National Socialist Germany, which is literally National Socialism. Well, I know you can quibble, it's not socialism, but I mean, it's kind of a centralized sort of totalitarian system, but it makes it work because it's got sort of like the cultural and ethnic component. Now, of course, you could always say, well, they're just socially determined themselves. You have to grow up and it's not really genetic, but still it's not sort of economic in basis. And so on that sort of theoretical level, sort of that's a failure with Marxism.
Yeah. So the other thing is he brings up the idea of the unconstrained and constrained vision from Thomas Sowell. So again, he's sort of tipping his hat here. Now, he claims that the big problem for Marxism and why communism failed was that it embraces a unconstrained vision. Now, this is what's interesting, right? Because on the one hand, you certainly look at the utopian nature of early communist Russia under Lenin, and then immediately shortly thereafter Stalin, where they really, they believed in the new socialist man. Trotsky believed that under socialism and communism, every man could be an Aristotle and a Marx and a Goethe or something. It was ridiculous. But on the other hand, you'll hear people who are tankies say, well, Marx never said we were going to abolish money. That's something else. Or they weren't going to do this or that. Haas is kind of like I guess you could say, seeking to correct the Western Marxist interpretation that a lot of us grew up with when we were hearing about Marxism for the first time. And then the question is, I guess, how much of an unconstrained vision was Marxism? Because it seems that Lenin started out with an unconstrained vision, but then it seems that Lenin gave up on it. So, for example, Moscow, like Berlin in the early 20s, was a bastion of free love, but then when it blew up, when it didn't work, Lenin just clamped down on it. Stalin became sort of an arch conservative. He in 1943, he allowed the church to operate again. He had pro-natalist policies. So, I mean, and then in what sense, then you could say, well, the Marxists were just being pragmatic and reacting to a situation that they had outstretched themselves. But then the problem is, well, were they always, are they either unscrupulous who just do what works, or are they utopian visionaries who have limitless constraints? Because you'll hear critics of Marxism say both. Right? Let's say on the one hand, it's an unconstrained vision. On the other hand, well, they're just gangsters that, do what works. Well, you can't have both. So I'm not entirely clear how to go forward with that, because we have two competing narratives of the communists in Russia from the same people, Keith.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. As far as the nature of communism, I think one problem that we have is that all of us are Westerners, so we're looking at it from a Western cultural and historical standpoint. But I think one thing that's important to consider is that every country that went communist was either an Asiatic country or it was a third world country. It never really took root in the West on the same level as it did in Asia or in the underdeveloped world, and primarily Asia. I mean, if you look at a map of when communism was at its apex in terms of influence, which was around 1980, you see that most of the communist countries were in Asia. So I think that communism in many ways has to be understood in an Asian context. I mentioned earlier the idea of the despotic God emperor state, that communism was essentially a resurrection of that within a secular philosophical framework. We have to remember that many political historians have often referred to this concept of Asian despotism, as opposed to Western models of government, rooted in the Greeks, Socratic dialogue and that kind of thing. Also, one point that I've seen Haas raise is interesting. He compares communism with what the Marxists traditionally call the Asiatic mode of production. And he gives us examples of that pre-modern societies like the Muscovites during early Tsardom, or King China, or even the Ottoman Turks. Haas describes all of these as proto-socialism or proto-communism, essentially arguing that the Asiatic mode of production is a type of proto-socialism, proto-Marxism, right? And looking at it from an Asian perspective, that's somewhat understandable. That picture makes some degree of sense. So I think that's one issue. As far as what communists were in terms of did they have a constrained or unconstrained vision? I think it's some of both, because like I said, an interesting interpretation of communism, of Marxism, by people like Murray Rothbard or like George Watson, is that it was a kind of quasi-conservative rejection of liberalism, but it was also carried a lot of the aspects of liberalism, like the tabula rasa. So it's sort of it's almost like a conservative liberalism in a way. So it has elements of both. And as far as the kinds of people that you find in communist movements, Jonathan Bowden, who was a European New Right figure, he died a few years ago, probably more than a few by now, but he gave a lecture once. I saw a video of one of his lectures where he was talking about the kinds of people that are typically drawn to far left groups. And I could identify with this because, having been around groups like that quite a bit for decades, I think what Bowden was saying was on the mark. And he said you get multiple different types of personalities in these kind of far left groups. You get some people that are just your standard hippie chick types who are all about, well, there needs to be more love in the world, and we need to be nicer to flowers and animals and trees and things like that. You definitely get a lot of that in the far left. You also get people who have this great sense of outrage over something that's been done to them or their people, their family, some collective they identify with. But you also get people that are, what used to be called eggheads, and that is people that are just absorbed in abstract theory. They get into Marxist theory and dialectical materialism the same way some people are really into mathematics or something like that. You get other people that are basically just power seekers. They just see this as a means to power. And a lot of these people basically just have a criminal personality type. And what happens is that in communist groups, you get all of these different types of people mixed together. And often it's the most aggressive, predatory, manipulative people who get to the very top of the pyramid. And then when groups like this actually get control of the state, that's double the case. So I don't think it's a coincidence, for example, that the guy who came out on top in the Soviet Union ultimately was Joseph Stalin. And what was Joseph Stalin in his early career? Well, he was a bank robber, he was a criminal. And if you look at Saddam Hussein's Iraq, now he wasn't a communist, but Baathism Baathist Arab socialism is a type of revolutionary socialism similar to communism. A lot of tanky types today identify with Baathism. They identify that as genuine socialism. But if you look at Saddam Hussein's early life, what was he? Same thing. He was a street gang leader. You know, he was a criminal. And he idealized the American mafia. He considered the American mafia to be a role model. So that, I think, explains why you see communist states starting off with this kind of revolutionary utopianism, and then they make the transition to these kinds of arch reactionary despotisms over time. I mean, aside from all the mechanisms involved, like, you know, wanting to suppress your opposition, you know, the natural effect of centralizing all wealth and property into the hands of the state, and all those kinds of things by nature are going to create a despotism. But also, I think once these kinds of people actually get into power and they're in the position of having to maintain power, they look at it like, well, what's going to work? You know, well, we've got to keep the people behind us to some degree. We've got to have some degree of legitimacy. So we'll appeal to nationalism. Or, well, the traditional culture of the people, we can't repress that too much. So we got to let the churches open again. Common people generally don't like a lot of sexual degeneracy. So we're going to suppress that as well. Or we need more people. We need a larger labor force. We're not going to allow abortion. And I think that's how these kinds of regimes ultimately function in practice.
Okay, Swithin.
I think Mises's analysis of Marxism to say that he advocated polylogism is interesting here, in that the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy and the proletariat all have different sort of logics. And one of the arguments was, I can't remember what Mises claimed Marx uses, effectively, is that, well, the bourgeoisie can't understand the pure reasoning of the proletariat, and so there's sort of, it's this ultimately irrational discourse between various economic classes. Now, when it comes to constrained or unconstrained, I mean, it seems clearly there that there is a constraint on thought built into Marxism, because, well, the bourgeoisie can't reason in the same way that proletarians. Now, it does seem to clear here that Marxism thinks the proletarian is correct, which is somewhat ironic given the fact that he was sort of a bourgeois individual in economic class. So performative contradiction raises its head here. So then the question arises, so you do have that sort of constraint. Then the question arises, though, well, if you were to ultimately go to the socialist state, that would the scales, as it were, fall from the eyes of the other economic classes? I don't remember any Marxist or communist writer explicitly referencing this, but I suppose what you could claim is, well, from Marx's perspective, yes, of course, the scales aren't going to fall from the rise. It's going to be a transitional process. I suppose you could make a case something like, we need them in childhood to be raised as communists, because there's this sort of hardening of the intellect and the approach of the individual when it went from birth to, like, I don't know, 16, 17, something like that. And so then you could sort of transform society over, theoretically, over a long time period, but not on a short. I mean, that would be a sort of, I think, a reasonable defense of sort of merging both the constrained and the unconstrained. That said, of course, if you had a communist society for 70 years, you really ought not to have any class division, because everybody who did believe the wrong stuff now doesn't, because everybody else has been raised in sort of a socialist upbringing, as it were. But theoretically, and Marxism should be unconstrained, but I could see how you could integrate some form of constraint, at least in a 70, 75, 80-year time period, something like that.
So I think ultimately the thing that I want to sort of move into in our final phase here is the claim that Marxism or communism failed. So, as you mentioned, Keith, the first thing is people like say, Caleb Maupin, for example, on Twitter has been engaging with this a lot. They'll be like, well, look at Russia before and after the revolution. Look at China before and after the revolution. Look at the economic development that occurred. And then you already also mentioned, Swithin, the debate between David Friedman and Richard Wolff. Now, I actually don't think East Germany was underdeveloped vis-a-vis West Germany, but I think it's fair to say that Russia and China were definitely underdeveloped vis-a-vis the Western European nations. And you could say, well, okay, look at how Russia was lagging behind in the 19th and early 20th centuries behind England and France and the United States and Germany. And then look at how under the communists, Russia reversed all that. Right, so you're not comparing Russia to the United States because the United States was far and away more advanced than Russia. But Russia reversed its negative decline vis-a-vis France and later even Germany and even Britain. So right by like 1980, it's more powerful than Germany, Britain, and France put together. So you could say the same with China. And then we have an interesting question too, is many on the right tend to love, these ideas of conquerors, warlords, and expeditions. So is Alexander the Great a success or a failure, right? On the one hand, he conquered an empire, but on the other hand, it collapsed as soon as he died. Many people on the right wouldn't consider Alexander a failure, especially since Alexander could inspire the actions of other men, right? Achilles inspired Alexander. Alexander inspired Caesar. There's that famous statement by Plutarch where Caesar is in Spain, standing under the statue of Alexander and weeps that at his age, Alexander had conquered an empire. Caesar had done nothing. So if you can create this mythopoetic identity that continues to inspire people in the future, I don't think you can say that's a failure. Because you could say, well, Achilles died young, Alexander died young, and his empire fell. But they keep on inspiring people. And it's that sort of like the choice that Achilles had. Do you want to live forever, or do you want to live a long time and then be remembered forever, or live a long time and be forgotten? And I think we can say whatever we would like about communism is that it has achieved that mythopoetic escape velocity, where it still inspires people today to do something, even if it's obviously not orthodox Marxist. As Sol Caleb has said, socialism has moved beyond certain 20th century limitations. I think, for example, the war on religion, didn't you bring that up to him once, Keith?
Yeah, well, from what I've seen of how socialism is developing worldwide, and yeah, some of these people in the patriotic socialist camps, like Caleb Maupin and Haas and others, have talked about this as well. But from what I've noticed of how socialist movements are developing internationally, and when I say socialist, I'm not talking about social democrats. Like, I'm not talking about Sweden and all of that stuff. But it seems that there's been a move away from hardline Marxism-Leninism of the Soviet variety. And the prevailing viewpoint today is more just of, yeah, that was an interesting phase of socialist history. We can learn from it. It wasn't perfect. We can build on that legacy, but we don't have to deify it, in the way that some past generations of communists did. But nowadays, socialism internationally is sort of branched off into a lot of different things that have moved beyond Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. For instance, most serious socialists today consider North Korea to be socialist, the Juka idea, but they also consider China, their Xi Jinping thought, socialism with Chinese characteristics. They consider that to be genuine socialism. They still consider Cuba and Vietnam and Laos and places like that to be socialist. Also, there's Bolivarianism in Latin America, like in Venezuela and Bolivia, I think, are the two countries where this has the most influence. They consider Nicaragua to be socialist, and Nicaragua's developed this kind of conservative Catholic socialism. They have a slogan. I think it's socialism, solidarity, and Christianity. And there is less antagonism toward religion worldwide among socialists. In fact, many socialists today consider Iran to be a legitimate socialist country, Islamic socialism. They consider Gaddafi to have been a legitimate socialist. They some of them claim Nasser for the left. In Africa, even you have African socialism now, and some of them are moving away from Marxism, in part because Marx was a racist. I mean, there's no getting around that. Marx was a racist, and so and then they can still consider Baathism to be a form of socialism. They consider Assad to be a socialist, for example. So socialism worldwide now is more about, it's really more like third positionism. It's really more the idea that revolutionary national states controlling their own domestic economies in resistance to Western imperialism and neoliberalism. That's kind of the ethos of socialism.
So to that point, right, and the historian Peter Hopkirk, in studying the East Ablaze, Lenin's Dream of an Asian Empire, views Lenin as the last great Asian conqueror in the vein of like a Genghis Khan, a Tamerlane, a Babar, or Nadir Shah. And I think we could argue, we have to be careful how we define the terms here, but given what we have with like historic Marxist literature, the modern evolution of socialism with people like Caleb Mappa and Haas and others, that you could say that socialism is a qualified success in two senses. One sense in that it creates that the old communist experiment in Russia and China was a mythopoetic source of inspiration for future people, just like Achilles and Alexander. Even though they, arguably were failures in other regards, they're not typically viewed as such by Western people. And okay, maybe they just conquered empires and then prevented, Anglo money from taking over. I mean, they, okay, in that case, I guess you could say they were a success too. Because again, you're going from like a feudal society. It would be like, a better example would be like if England became communist and America remained capitalist. Both were highly developed economic societies. How would the two function? Don't know. Didn't happen, right? Germany's a little more interesting, but it's, an occupied country, obviously, East Germany. So that's what I have. So what would you say to that framing, Keith, the sort of like unorthodox position here?
Yeah, I think that it may be that places like Maoist China or the Soviet or Bolshevik Russia have the function now among socialists of being like a mythical utopia from the past, almost like Atlantis. It's the idea that, there were these places where we did these things and with at least some degree of success. And while they may not have endured over time, they're something that inspire us, for the future. One thing that's interesting too now is that a lot of the communists of today, they are pro-Russian. To call Russia in its present form socialist is a bit of a reach. I'd say Putin is closer to being a bourgeois nationalist, more like Modi or Erdogan than actual socialism. Now he's against NATO and the United States and all of that, but that's geopolitics. That's not about economic theories per se. But Russia I would say is a type of national capitalist regime that may be aligned with some of these other regimes that modern socialists consider to be socialist. So obviously that would explain why they have a pro-Russian outlook. Like I said, though, I think socialism seems to be evolving in a direction similar to third positionism. Like it hasn't quite gotten there yet. They typically will say, well, third positionism is fascism. It's not socialism. But if you just actually believe, it's basically the same thing. It's this idea, well, Russia is socialist, China is socialist, Iran is socialist, Syria is socialist, Cuba is socialist. And then they'll add to that the Strasser right wing of the original NSDAP. And, I've heard some of them even say that like the American style Benjamin Tucker, cooperative socialism, even that is real socialism. So, that seems to be the direction socialism and communism are going in today. And it is an interesting trajectory. And I do think that it's something that has moved past this kind of pure Marxism or orthodox Leninism in a way that perhaps sheds some of the more fantastical ideas that are associated with that. One thing, for example, I've noticed about a lot of these modern socialists is that they greatly dislike Trotsky. Trotsky is not a popular figure at all in those circles, and not just because he was Stalin's enemy, but I think his theories are widely rejected. Because he's viewed as sort of a prototype for these kinds of middle-class liberal socialists you find in social democrats you find in the West today, where, well, to them, socialism is just about ecology and animal rights and LGBTQ and, the more democratic socialist of American types. I think they view Trotsky as a prototype of that stuff. And when you listen to these actual socialists talk about this woke stuff, they sound like somebody from Fox News. They sound like they're to the right of Fox News, which I find interesting.
All right, Swithin, we'll leave you with a final word. What do you think about this unorthodox understanding that maybe communism was successful?
I mean, that's certainly an interesting way of looking at it, which has its merits. This reminds me of my reading of Bruce Gilley, who I think Bruce Gilley is his name, who wrote The Case for Colonialism. And then the response to his critics. And his main argument against all the anti-colonialist historians is that, well, what are you comparing the colonial era, which he specifically talks about the late 18th century and then early to the early 20th. He ignores the earlier stuff because he says they didn't have direct rule from Europe at that point. It was kind of done by private individuals. Anyway, leave that aside. The question is a standard of comparison. How do we determine how good colonialism was relative to what? And so he chides his critics for saying that, well, basically, because we didn't have Sweden, we didn't have the social democratic state there, then colonialism was bad. And it's like, well, what did you think you were going to get if you didn't have the colonial governments? Now, Gilley could clearly be wrong. Gilley's positive assessment of colonialism could well be false. But I think what we would have to say is, of a standard of comparison is, this is what we had, and then realistically, we could have had this setup or this one, and then delineate what was, we think, really possible, and then trying to work with some sort of counterfactual analysis, which I won't go quite as far as say is impossible, but is blooming hard and requires a lot of assumptions. Then you tend to get, well, what we'll do is we'll compare the Soviet Union to prior. So what you might do is look at, say, growth rates before the revolution and after the revolution, so you compare like with like. But then again, though, you've got to take that into account that you've got to look at, well, did Western growth rates increase for certain particular reason? Was there any sort of technological advancement which somehow copied there, and so therefore we would have expected it? So I mean, success or failure, I mean, this is even without getting into the question of, well, what constitutes, what parameters are we going to use to say it succeeds? I mean, so for instance, if you want to say that, take Kaczynski's position, you want some sort of like primitivist understanding of freedom, well, any increase in life expectancy is clearly outweighed by the loss of freedom, and so therefore it's bad. So, I mean, I think it's a very interesting topic. I mean, I think, as I said before, I think it's certainly clear that the communist states certainly weren't hugely desirous places to live. And as I say, North and South Korea seem to be one of the best natural experiments we could reasonably expect when it comes to performance. But it is a very, very difficult thing to do strictly. And I think really, it would be interesting if you say, got Caleb Ballpin on and go, okay, let's agree on what constitutes a good society, broadly speaking, and then let's agree on the methodology as best as possible, and then go from there. I think would be an interesting discussion. And I think a lot of the time when any of these success or failure discussions take place, there isn't sufficient groundwork done to clarify the methodology and what we're comparing it with to come up with a clear answer.
Well, all right. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Swiffen. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.